Hello, thank you for joining us. Welcome. This is our second panel discussion where we're using material from the Northcote Theatre Archive to kickstart some conversations about culture and theatre and the roles that these things play in our lives and our local community now. So I'm Sophie, I'm the Heritage Manager at the Northcote, and I'm managing the National Lottery funded project with our archive. And a really important theme that has stood out for our team of interns during their research work with the archive is the theme of diversity and representation of people with diverse ethnicities. And chairing the panel this evening is Louisa Adjoa Parker, who has just begun a journey looking at this area of the archive and the theatre's history in more detail, and has been working really closely with Latifa Wallace, who is one of our brilliant interns, who's been leading the archival research into this theme. Some of Latifa's initial findings and reflections can be found on our website as well. And it's this research that's provided us with a few items and stories from the archive, which has kind of acted as inspiration for our discussion and for our key questions tonight. So I'm just going to share a few bits with you now. So here we have a photo set, which is of the first production ever staged at the Northcote in 1967. It was The Merchant of Venice, and the role of the Jewish character Shylock was performed by the theatre's artistic director at the time, Tony Church, and received at the time much praise for its lack of stereotyping and caricature. But there is a real legacy of cultural appropriation, and it's something that's featured in various productions over the theatre's history, including through early works such as Narrow Road to the Deep North. There are documentation of kind of several incidents of blackface, and also in more recent productions of such as pantomimes. So we're looking at these in a little bit more this evening, and also talking a bit about the balance between appropriation and appreciation. Here we also have an extract from a document describing a project and a play that was toured to schools in 1973. It was exploring the theme of slavery with young people. It was a project that attracted both praise and a lot of kind of local controversy at the time. And it's also a piece that really highlights the tension between entertainment as education, as well as the challenges of kind of presenting complex histories in respectful ways. Some of the methods used by performers, who were all white, are, insensitive, simplistic, but were praised at the time. And we've also, kind of our early research, we found this letter from the Arts Council from 1986. And this is the first time it really became a requirement for funded arts organisations to commit to engagement with ethnically diverse artists and audiences. And this really kind of marks a shift in the responsibilities of major arts organisations, but it also really highlights how, kind of, despite this being over 35 years old now, this document, that arguably quite little has changed, and a lot of the language has also kind of remained the same. This is an image of Thomas Baptiste, who performed in several performances at the Northcote in the early 80s. This is him in some publicity for a Shakespeare production that he was in 1981. At this point, Thomas Baptiste was already a very prolific TV and film actor and spoke really candidly in the press about the limited roles for Black actors at the time. In the 1960s, he co-founded an advisory committee of the British Actors Equity Association to represent Black actors in Britain. And in an interview which appeared in 1992, Baptiste said that he thought that Black actors were having even more difficulty beginning their careers than he had found sort of 40 years previously. Latifa also recently was looking into the work of Helena Callanan, who's an actor we believe was local to Devon and appeared in Northcote productions. This production is called Balls, which was a play set in South Devon and focuses on the game of skittles and its importance to kind of the local culture. This was in 1994. So while there are kind of these casting choices are notable and positive, their notability also kind of really highlights the absence of diverse casting more widely. Kind of to talk a bit more about some of the kind of case studies that Latifa's found, quite a lot of this content's kind of are currently undergoing digitization so they can reach a new audience. So I think Louise will talk a little bit more about some of the case studies she's found, for instance, with the career of Tom Wu in the early 90s, and also a bit about the voice of the press and the representation and how this has changed over the years. So Latif and Louise will be working on these ideas a little bit more and providing kind of a full review and reports this summer, which we'll publish. We'll also be sharing a bit more information at the end about how you can get involved in some workshops and focus groups. But for now, it'd be really great. I'm just going to hand over to Louisa, who's chairing the event, who will introduce herself and the panel and talk a bit more about the context for tonight.
Thank you, Sophie, and good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to be working with the Northcott. I'm very grateful to all the sort of Latifa has been leading the research of the archives, and my role I sort of feel now is kind of to pull stuff together and sort of interrogate the findings, and I have been involved in some of the archival research as well. So I'm Louisa, I'm a writer and poet, I'm an equality, diversity and inclusion consultant, and I've lived in the Southwest for 36 years now. First moved to Devon in 1985. And actually looking at some of those images, I really wish I'd known that there were performances with Black or mixed race characters back in the 80s, because I never saw any other person of colour, for years when I lived here. So I wish I'd known about them then. So I'm really, really excited to be joined by Sandhya Dave, who is a diversity consultant, anti-racism practitioner, body psychotherapist who's interested in trauma and well-being. And we're also being joined by Alix Harris, who's a writer, founder and artistic director of Beyond Face. So the three of us have crossed paths a few times over the years, but this is the first time I think we've all been together on a panel. So I'm really, really excited to have some conversations with you both and hear your thoughts. So we've got some questions that we're going to sort of talk through. And I think the first aspect really is thinking about stories. So one of the things that I sort of thought about in relation to what Sophie just shared, one of the press clippings or the letters from the Arts Council, was thinking about what's been going on behind the scenes. So, for example, the public might not necessarily know about any equalities work that's being done in the arts or being done in theatre, because this may not be sort of necessarily communicated to the public very well. So it might be that there's one of the things I want to talk about a bit later on is the role of the press in communicating what the theatre has done over the years and thinking a bit more about that. But I think it might be that there may be, stuff was happening around equalities and around thinking around language, thinking around diversity representation, even back in the 80s when perhaps not many of us were aware of this sort of thing happening. But I think that some of the stories that we've sort of discovered so far, I think there's definite gaps in the sense of 70s and 80s in relation to representation of ethnically diverse and Black characters. And then as you sort of move more into the 90s, there's more representation. I think Thomas Baptiste was in the 80s and the 90s as well. So we do have some ethnically diverse actors, but I think one of the things we need to really think about is how are they portrayed? How are these stories told? And even if you're telling a story about Black or Asian people, how can this be done in a way that isn't problematic? So, for example, some of the images we came across, there were quite a lot of white actors who were playing East Asian or Black characters. In the example, I think Sophie mentioned a play called Slavery, which was toured, I think it was early 1970s. That was actually taken to schools, and the language used in the clip that Sophie just showed sort of talked about comedy, participation, and it's sort of thinking, well, how could we better have a play about the slave trade and sort of think and do it in a way that is sensitive and actually appropriate to the content. What are your sort of thoughts, Alix and Sandhya, in terms of how do we tell these stories in a way that is sort of representative and also extremely sensitive and inclusive? Do you have any sort of initial thoughts around just sort of storytelling in general?
I'll start, Alix. Hi everyone, hello, thanks for inviting me along, and yeah, really excited to be on this panel with Louisa and Alix, and Sophie and Laura. Thank you for all the kind of support and help and initiation, really. I think for me, often when we're telling a story, it's about looking at the context, background of the story. What is it, where's it coming from, whose story is it, whose heritage is close to it, who's connected to it. And so, for example, if we just go with slavery, maybe perhaps generationally looking at people who might be closely connected to that, and then asking them, really, because they'll be the experts. They'll be holding the kind of, I guess if we're going to dive into it, that kind of intergenerational trauma around it. So it's asking them what's, how would you like this story told? What would be a way to tell it to age appropriate? I can't imagine there's any way that you can make a story about slavery entertaining. I just can't. It just doesn't sit right with me. So that would be my first point of reference, which would be to go back to the kind of connected people to that story, to ask them for advice and guidance, as to how to tell the story. That would be my initial thinking. Alix.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I think that it's interesting with archive, because all we see is the actors. And in theatre, there's more than the actors. In order for the actors to be on stage and to be photographed, there has to be most likely a writer, a director. There's a team behind that don't get photographed unless they come into your rehearsal room. And I think just to kind of follow on from what Sandhya is saying about, it's like the research is the first phase and whose story it is, and then often what happens is there might be a really good body of research done and really good engagement with people originally, and then it gets filtered down and gets lost along the way because it turns into a thing about entertainment, or it becomes about the product. And I really think that we are, some theatre makers, some people are getting better about thinking about the whole experience that the audience get when they're engaging with theatre, and thinking about you're watching a show and then what next. And often, I think, good theatre asks questions, but also what are theatre organisations doing to enable to hold those conversations, or to hold those questions, or to signpost and navigate further questions. So I think it's about, the continual experience, and also in terms of what Sandhya is saying, is like checking back with those people, like having those people, particularly if it's verbatim, like having those people in the room to have a look at how the story is being told, being part of the casting process. I think there's so much that gets missed because there's a filtering process that unfortunately happens.
Thank you both. Yes, do you want to add something, Sandhya?
I was just going to say, I wonder how much of that happens, because I think this conversation here is really interesting because it's about the demographics of the Southwest as well. So I kind of want to just plow in with that. And I wonder, like Alix is saying, there's that whole kind of research and development phase of any production, isn't there? And I wonder how much historically that was done sensitively, appropriately, and I wonder how much it's done now, currently. And that would be a really critical question that we can carry on talking about. And Alix, you would definitely have more to say around that. How much is it really done still now?
Yeah, because I think there's also we have to talk about tokenism as well, right? And particularly now, and people being seen to be doing it as opposed to actually it being really genuine and authentic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, obviously feel free to expand on that as well, but I think just thinking about the emotional impact on audiences who have a lived experience, I think that is what, it feels as though the wider community has just started to think about this really perhaps for the first time. And I think the emotional impact, Sandhya, you talked about the intergenerational trauma. I think it's very important to bear this in mind and remember when we're exploring, when we're having these kind of conversations, but also thinking about going forward and sort of moving into the future. But I think you both raised some really, really interesting points around storytelling. Is there anything else you wanted to sort of say in relation to those?
I think there's also within kind of stories and the stories getting to the stage, and particularly in the Southwest, I also think it's about this label of artists, and who gets to be an artist and who gets that status and who gets to be in the buildings in the first place. And I think often, community theatre or young people's work in community is often given the to the side, or go like, oh, didn't you do well? And actually, when you watch community theatre or you watch young people's theatre, those stories are so rich but they're not necessarily given the status of like a professional piece of work. And I think that that's something that also needs looking at. And often, you know, people from ethnically diverse backgrounds get marginalized into community and get put in that box. So I think that that's, particularly in the Southwest, I think that's something that really, again, is something that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of thinking about how these stories have been told and how they're presented, one of the things you suggested, Sandhya, was sort of having a discussion around, are we in danger of repeating the same sort of themes for storytelling around racism? So are we repeating, you know, constantly telling the stories of struggles versus sort of resilience and contributions? I think that is a sort of, that's quite an ongoing problem that cuts across all sectors when it comes to any kind of representation relating to ethnic diversity, particularly. What are your thoughts on how do we make sure we don't just repeat these kind of stories of victim over and over and over again? And how do we, you know, tell stories of people from ethnic diverse backgrounds that have actually had fantastic lives, have been incredibly resilient, because actually to survive and to live in a racist society, particularly in the Southwest, as we're here and talking about that tonight, it takes a lot of resilience to actually just kind of keep going. And there's so many contributions that people have made, and perhaps we don't sort of know about them, or they're not widely known. How do we sort of move towards the shift? How do we shift towards, you know, telling these stories of resilience and contributions, and not just simply saying, oh, you know, Black history is just about slavery, and, you know, sort of reducing it to that sort of narrative? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the answer to that is it's a bit of a quandary, because on the one level, because racism still exists in the Southwest, because racism does have impact, you know, on a daily basis, those stories still need to be told. You know, because we know that the stats are low for Black practitioners in the theatre, whether they're director, like Alix, you know, writers, you know, actors, whatever, you know, sound engineers, whatever kind of area we're looking at in the creative arts, the stats are low for Black and Asian minority ethnic people. And so those stories and the institutional racism that comes alongside those stories that stops people from going forward still exist, and therefore those stories have to be told. And yet, you know, I want Alix to be able to come on and just talk about theatre, but not do the diversity bit. You know, so it's a kind of interesting one. And then for me, it's always about the lens. You know, so at the Global Centre, one of the places where I work in, you know, we've just done 2 years now of celebrating Windrush and Devon project, and, you know, to kind of model and answer, you know, the whole kind of angle of the project is about celebrating contributions. So yeah, really acknowledging difficulties and hardships, but actually here's this group of amazing people and look at what they give us. And it's those stories that we're bringing out. It's those stories of contributions, of their quite incredible leaders in their own spaces. And then we might deep dive for the difficulties. So it's kind of like, you know, what does the audience want to hear? What do we need to hear as a society as a whole? What are the stories that, we just haven't heard? You know, we just haven't. Faye, the beautiful midwife senior lecturer, you know, and Des, the ex-police officer, and he's an ex-police officer because of racism, but actually he went into that profession in the first place, you know. So it's a kind of quandary, and it's not straightforward, but for me, it's the lens, and for me, it's like looking at, you know, and as you've just so beautifully put, it's looking past that these people are incredibly resilient. I'm incredibly resilient, but there's more to me than my racism. You know, there's more to me than my trauma, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandhya. I think you're absolutely right. There's a real tension in sort of wanting to tell these stories, and it is important for the wider white community to hear the stories around racism, because we still don't really have that much kind of qualitative data in terms of in any field, whether it's academia or the arts. We don't have that much, and there is so much potentially out there. And as we know, there's been more gathering of that sort of recently. But I think it's also about, we don't always want to just talk about stories of racism. We don't always want to talk about pain. And I think that sort of I don't know how you both find it, but I do find that sometimes it feels like I'm being sort of exploited, and it sometimes feels as though I'm not obviously working in theatre, but as a writer and trainer, it feels as though I'm sort of performing my pain in a way. for other people to sort of learn from, and that can feel quite challenging. And sometimes I do want to just talk about trees or or something. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a real tension between managing those. I think you're right to say it's about the lens and thinking how we do that. Alix, what are your thoughts on how, you know, sort of juggling all that and trying to sort of focus on the positive and resilience as well as the difficult stuff?
Yeah, so this is the thing that keeps me awake at night, because you know, for people who don't know, Beyond Face is a theatre company whose mission is to raise the profile and visibility of Black and brown people, artists, young people, and communities in the Southwest in terms of theatre. And when I first started the company, well, not even first started the company, like a couple of years in, made a piece of work called Who's Looking Back at You? And that piece of work was an opportunity to just, like, it was a devised piece. It was exploring the stories of the cast members. And there was a moment in it where Corinne went to tell a story about her grandmother's trauma. And I watched the audience in that moment, and we really wanted to play with it because she was like, oh, I remember Grandma when you came over here, it was really hard for you. And I watched the audience lean in, like physically lean in, almost as if they were saying, like, here's the trauma moment that we've been waiting for, because that none of the piece so far had given any sense of racism in it. And, you know, we really pushed it. So Corinne looks at the audience and went, oh, do you know what? Nah, that's not for now. And you literally saw people go, oh. And I remember this guy coming up to me after the show going, well, that was different, wasn't it? And I was like, and I was like, okay. And he was like, that was really good. And I was like, thanks. And I was not expecting that. And I said, oh, okay, what were you expecting? Well, I just wasn't expecting that. And I was like, well, could you be a bit more specific? Like, I was like, it was just really, yeah, that was really, like, you know, and he just couldn't get the words out. And that was really interesting. And then another piece of work that we did, which was around Black women in the Southwest, but which did have racism in it, but it wasn't this, again, focus. It was about these 3 Black women working in a paper flower shop, and it was about them being beautiful and the metaphor of flowers and really pulling that out. But people still came in and they took the trauma from it, and they kind of audiences wanted to talk to me about the pain of it. And I was like, but it's such a beautiful show, and actually and no matter how hard I tried. But then there was the Black woman who came to see it in Plymouth, and she was not happy, let me tell you, that she didn't want to come and see the show. They were late, they walked in, and she was just like, I don't want to be here. And by the end of it, like, she was laughing. She came up to me at the end and went, you put me on stage, you don't even know me, and you put me on, like, that was me on stage. She was like, that's my story. And it was such a beautiful moment. And I'm just constantly thinking about it, because I get people in the audience come to me and say, thank you for putting that on stage, because I want people to know about it. But then at the same time, I think we have an issue with, like, trauma porn. I think people get off on seeing pain on stage and needing that and going, you are this. And I think in the last year, with everyone's Black Lives Matter statements and all of that, like, I have felt really fearful of people doing all this training and everything, and then that their lens now shifts from going, oh, I see you, and now I feel sorry for you, and you must be coming with this big baggage with you, you must be and actually that's what I worry about in terms of theatre. And I guess the last thing I'll say on this is, I get, like, being in Zoom spaces with other directors in London and hearing people go, oh, we don't want to do that anymore, we don't want to do that story, we don't want to talk about pain, we don't want to do that. And then I sit in spaces in Plymouth and Exeter and speak to other theatre people here, and I'm like, man, you've not even had those stories yet. And I don't think there's a set answer. I guess I would say I get frustrated that I spend every week in meetings trying to figure it out with my team, and I'm not pretty sure that other arts organisations are not having the same thought and having to have that battle or even thinking about it. They just look at their budgets and go, yeah, we'll programme that show and we've done our creative case tick box. And that's what frustrates me, because there's not enough resource. And then people want to help me as opposed to work with me. I could rant all day about that, so I'm going to mute myself.
Don't worry, I know your feeling. I think that was some really really positive examples, so thank you for sharing those with us. Did you want to add something, Sandhya?
I do. I always want to add something.
Okay, go for it.
because I think, what Alix is also raising is, and as I was hearing it, is like this contracted little box that she will get put into, you will get put into. And then I will have to operate from that. Like, no one knows that I do love trees, right? And I've set up a charity planting trees. I never get to talk about that. It's that kind of, where are the other things? Where are the other things that we do that we get to talk about? But I think also, how much creativity are we losing from our Black practitioners? Because they are being forced almost to retell some of the same stories again and again and again. And they can't just talk about, the little bit of shiny piece of plastic that they found on the scaffolding that absolutely stimulated them to write this incredible poem, and it has nothing to do with identity or race, And I think for me, it's always kind of looking back at, what is the whole story of this person? What is the whole story of this person? And the trauma is not the whole story. Of course, it is an incredibly impactful piece of it, but it's not necessarily the whole story. And that's really important to remember, And I'm just kind of quickly, slip in something else. We run this thing called Resilient Roots. It's a group, a safe space group, brave, safe sharing space for people of colour.
I was going to ask you about that actually, because I've been meaning to come along and I haven't, but we can chat later on. But sorry, carry on.
I'm really organised. I might put it even in the chat, or maybe Laura can find it for us on Facebook. But from that, what I'm also hearing, and just kind of bringing in what Alix was saying, is that then what happens for people of colour is that there's a kind of paranoia almost. There's a self-doubt questioning of like, am I here because I'm Black, because I'm a person of colour? Or am I here because actually I'm really talented? I can do an amazing job directing or writing, or, So it's really interesting what that brings as well for the Black practitioners.
And I think just to stay on that, because I get asked that question all the time, or people, if like I had an amazing opportunity of getting into an opportunity for a theatre in London, which was really amazing and really I felt really confident about it. And someone said, oh yeah, I've heard the artistic director wants more Black directors, wants more. And I was like, oh, actually, and like because people just throw that in there or go, well, you're bound to get that, or you're bound to get the funding because of that. And so it just, those little things. And I guess like also financially, people will throw money at the trauma. They'll go, oh yeah, if you can go and make that. And I think that artists and young people should be able to comfortably say, no, please, can I make a piece of work about a scaffold structure? Because that's what I would like to make. That's what I'm going to make, Sandhya. That's my next project. You wait.
That sounds good.
Yeah,
sounds good. I think you're both absolutely right, and I think that the problem is that sometimes we don't get seen as full human beings. When we're having these, when this kind of work is being done, it's sort of like, people can get sort of. I sometimes feel like I've been sort of used or exploited because of my heritage, and it's we definitely need to think more carefully about this, and also think about intersectionality as well, and the different sort of forms of marginalisation that can intersect with being a person of colour, and particularly in the Southwest. There's also sort of intersections like rural deprivation, which can be sort of problematic. I'm conscious. Sorry, carry on.
I think if there's the pressure of feeling like you can't make a mistake. So then if you do get an opportunity, and we should be allowed to make mistakes in the work, but it's like, people going, well, why did you do that? Because you represent a whole, group of people. So if you mess up, nearly swore then, if you mess up, then you potentially are detrimenting an opportunity because you go, oh, well, we can't, people are this.
And there's too much pressure, isn't it? Feeling like you represent a whole load of other people who you don't even know. That can feel. I felt like that over the years living in the Southwest, even just not related to the arts, but just being a person of colour. When I meet white people, I sometimes think they've not met a Black person before, so I've got to be nice. I've got to make them like me, which is quite weird and twisted, but I'm sure you can understand. So I'm going to move us on to the next questions, really, which we sort of came up with. And one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about was the press and the role of the press. So I noticed in the archives that the role of the press was very sort of instrumental, obviously, in presenting the Northcott to the community. And I feel as though my perspective was that there was quite a lot of bias. There was quite a lot of individual journalists who just didn't like the Northcott for whatever reason and were super critical. Every time we tried to do something new and innovative, they were really heavily critical of them. And that was sort of more, I guess, to do with perhaps the editor of the paper, or perhaps there was, I don't know the story behind it, but it seemed as though they were quite geared against the Northcott just generally. And I think that would have presented a kind of perhaps a misleading image of what the Northcott was actually doing behind the scenes in terms of inclusivity and so on. So I was just wondering, I'm interested to find out how that might have changed in terms of theatre and relationships with local press. And I think that obviously it's different now because organisations, we've got social media, we've got different ways of promoting. Organisations can promote themselves rather than being reviewed by sort of self-proclaimed armchair critics. This seems to be what happened quite a lot in the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s in relation to Northcott. But Alix, what are your thoughts on sort of relation in terms of theatres? What's your experience or thoughts on how the relationship with the local media plays a part in how the theatre is presented, and whether it's always like sort of an accurate portrayal of what's happening, or whether it's got that sort of media bias and that sort of slant which doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I'm waffling a bit, but yeah, I just wanted to hear what your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've not had a good time necessarily with press, particularly recently. I think that, I guess it goes back to that thing about programming and the stories, and commercial theatre, well-known plays are, people know that those things sell, and essentially press is about getting bums on seats. And I think I think as we come out of this lockdown, I think that's going to be even more so, because it's going to be about kind of getting people back into the theatre. And I think a lot of venues are going to still, unfortunately, go back to how certain things were, and just kind of really go with the safe performances. So I think that my experience has been more about the lack of protection. So when I first set up Beyond Face, there was a bit of press done on it, and it was a really nice article that they approached me to talk about, but then there was just really nasty comments, people accusing me of running a circus, just like really nasty things, and I just wasn't supported. So every time we have a conversation with the theatre, like they always want to go to local press, and we have to have like a big conversation around of which angle is it coming at, and how do we tell the story that we want to tell, and trying to kind of take ownership over that. And when it's written, sometimes that's been easier to do, but when we've had like the BBC and people that kind of filming us, there's obviously those real like provocative questions, and they want to go to the trauma. So those questions, and it always lends in that way. Even with 2000 Stories that we did a couple of years ago was about empathy and storytelling, and then it was still needing to be about people's questions and the angle of which they wanted to frame it. And again, that goes with another set of responsibilities, because you suddenly become, your story, which should be about selling the show, becomes about educating people. And I also think, in terms of theatre press, like people don't come down to the Southwest. So I think you've also got like it's really hard to get reviews. It's really hard to get people even in Bristol to come down to Plymouth or to Exeter to see work. So I think in terms of this whole conversation, like bringing it back to that thing about how it is to be a person of colour, like to be in the Southwest is I'm not saying it's worse than anywhere else, but it comes with that, that extra challenge. And I don't think that the press are behind that. I will say that actually the Herald in Plymouth did a really good job of combating a lot of the racism last year around the Black Lives Matter marches. And that was the first time that I really saw a shift don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, no, that's good to hear. I think it's really important to think about responsibilities and sort of a lack of protection. And I think that often, I don't know, Black artists can get the sort of feeling that sometimes we're kind of like thrown to the wolves when it comes to sort of talking about race in local media. And I've certainly had that experience a few times, and I'm sure we can sort of relate. Sandhya, was there anything you wanted to add in terms of sort of relationship? Oh, Alix, would you like to add?
No, I'm just, she's like sat here like this. Going,
Okay.
I guess what's coming through for me is around power, right? Because the press has such incredible power. And when we're talking about, say, theatre, I'm thinking about the responsibility that even, say, for example, we're at the Northcote today, a theatre like the Northcote can pull in that power from the press. So I guess I'm kind of just thinking about responsibilities, power. The Northcote could actually really aid, Black arts, for example, to get that review, just to get the review full stop, and then check it, challenge it if it's not fair, or if it's actually, full of hate, So that's all I wanted to say, that actually institutions that are kind of established, organizations that have pulling power can be real allies in this,
Yeah, I think we're absolutely right. And I think there should be some sort of responsibility and accountability when it comes to managing these stories and these issues. So I'm gonna, with so much to talk about, we could just be here for all night, couldn't we? So I'm gonna sort of basically ask you both what your thoughts on how do we present or showcase difficult parts of history. So, for example, one of the things that Latifa, I think Sophie mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that Latifa and I found was a folder in the archives which contained images of white actors in blackface. And there was no warning. So I'd been going through looking at these beautiful black and white images of children watching a play. And then suddenly there's images of white actors in blackface. And I felt very upset. Latifa said she felt upset as well. And one of the things I'm going to talk about in the report, or the final thing that I write, is going to be the emotional response on us as Black women who are doing the research. So I think that we can't really separate that in this kind of case. But in terms of how would we better prepare sort of future researchers for potentially triggering content, and how do we kind of acknowledge this will be different for different people? So somebody with no lived experience of racism might see that and be fine. One of us might see that and feel incredibly distressed. How can we then sort of present this history, sort of contextualize or sensitive, content warnings, or what are your sort of thoughts on showcasing things such as this? Another thing I found which was upsetting was there was a white actor, a woman who was also a local children's writer, and she was playing the part of Gollywog. There's an image of her with this head next to her. So that was sort of upsetting. So what are your thoughts really on how do we present this? What are the sort of things we consider? How do we do this in a way that is sensitive and taking consideration? Or do we just get rid of them? Like, do we just get rid of all this kind of stuff? What are your thoughts?
Oh, Alix.
So it's a big question, isn't it?
First, you can.
Oh, okay, I'll go. I mean, can't just get rid of them because history teaches us many things. History is telling us about the past, and it really helps to shape and inform us about where we want to go in the future. So, and there's a context to everything. So yeah, absolutely. I really hear that you were upset by those things, but gollywogs were absolutely acceptable. There was a time space when they were absolutely acceptable. It was acceptable for a Plymouth man to change his coat of arms to a black boy and change John Hawkins, because he thought it was acceptable to sell black boys, sell black people. So there's a kind of historical time frame that we need to always view things in, but absolutely there needs to be protection. There needs to be protection for you, for example, if you're going into that archive. There needs to be protection, I think, like you just said, with content warning, for anybody, where if there was something really sexually violent, we'd have a content warning. So why not something that might be upsetting around racism? I'm going to pause there because I've lost track. So Alix, take over and then I'll come back to it.
Thank you, Sandhya.
Yeah, I think it's, I think for me, it's also about again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning about framing a performance of what happens before and after. And I think for me, it's also about what is what is the purpose of the organization? Like for the Northcote, for example, like I there's an issue right here in terms of projects. So projects come out, whether that be a physical theatre project or whatever, like, here's an idea for a project, let's bring it out, let's bring people in, let's get their expertise, let's do this, let's put it out on public display, let's have a little bit of discourse about it, let's write an evaluation, and then we move on to the next thing. But for you and other people, and those people with lived experience, that is, you got to come in with your lived experience, then experience other people's lived experience, and then go and continue that additional lived experience layered on top of you. And I think that it's about those organizations recognizing that and owning the responsibility of that, owning their own kind of their privilege to be able to sit there and look at, to have to look through the archive first and think really hard about what they're looking at. And they are responsible, I think, for communicating with the artist or whoever it is that they're bringing on board. Because it shouldn't be you having to experience that moment to go, there's a problem here. And I think that for me, it's like it's like walking into a theatre building and you're like, oh, okay, I'm the only brown person, black person in this space. Immediately, you've got to do your check and look around and get and all of those sorts of stuff. And I think that, I just wish that organisations would, I think organisations need to recognise what people with lived experiences are walking into. And really taking that step, of going, what does it mean when I open this door? Who will be the first person I see? What will be that person's first experience? In the same way as you might prep a building for a school coming in and thinking about children and going, okay, let's make sure they can't touch that because they shouldn't. It's like we put all of that stuff in place for lots of other different characteristics. And like you said, Sandhya, like with, anything to do with sexual violence, we put all that prep in, and I think that we don't do that enough around racism. There's not enough.
I think it's kind of like safeguarding, isn't it? I suppose it's like safeguarding with children and young people. And I think that so I was actually I was told that these images would be in there. I just wasn't expecting them at that moment. So I think it was just the shock of seeing this plain envelope and then opening it and finding that. But I think doing the preparation, taking responsibility, I think really, really important things to consider. Sandhya, did you want to add anything?
I'm just loving the way you're tuning into me wanting to add something else. Thank you. I think because what we're talking about here is absolutely safeguarding, but we're talking about well-being, aren't you? We're talking about staff well-being. So again, any institution that is inviting practitioners of, if you like, any kind of diversity strand, equality strand to do work needs to look after their staff. So, for you to have maybe, like I'm doing a piece of work with Devon County Council, and we've actually funded in some kind of debriefing time because we know that it's just bringing up lots of stuff for us. So we then need to meet as a team and speak about that. So for you to have some sort of mentoring time, I don't charge that much, by the way, Louisa. So you could come and see me, and then have some debriefing.
That's good to know. Thanks, Sandhya.
Around an hour, isn't it?
I think we should all put our prices up. That's another discussion. I think you're absolutely right. I think it is about well-being as well, and looking after staff, whether it's staff that are in the organisation, staff that we're bringing in externally, and considering well-being. And I think for me, well-being is a really integral part of any kind of inclusion work. I think it absolutely has to go hand in hand with
I do think there's something about also with budgets, like budgeting in, like we're doing it now as a company, but budgeting in people like Sandhya, like additional support so that you have that space to go to, especially if you're working for an all-white organisation and that there's no one there that you can go to, so that, and even if it means that actually you just go for coffee with someone and you don't talk about it, it's just that knowing that you have that space, that makes such a difference, I think.
It sounds fantastic. So the whole I've never experienced anything like that, and I just thought of
mentoring.
thinking someone I could talk to about this who would get it would be fantastic. Sorry, Sandhya, what were you going to say?
Well, and just kind of, adding to that around, what Alix was saying around buildings, for example, or exhibitions, it's kind of, again, it's coming back to what we were talking about right at the beginning about how we tell these stories and who, if you were to put an exhibition up around this topic and the archives, and then I wanted to bring the Windrush group in to see it because I'd like to bring them into the theatre space. I'd like to encourage them to, visit. I don't want them to be faced with a black and white minstrel, show right at the beginning. So we're kind of having, the sensitivity of how do we arrange an exhibition, for example? How do we arrange a show? What does the Northcote, if you like, feel like as a building? To people, and there's a whole conversation about decolonizing buildings. What does that space feel like for people to enter and come into, and what are they faced with? Is someone smiling at them when they come in? Really simple. What are they faced with in terms of displays? What does their website look like? Am I going to see anybody who looks like me? Am I going to see a show there that I think, that's kind of speaking about me in some way, so, Alix, come in.
Thank you. Alix is waggling her finger.
I'm doing Sandhya. We'll get it trending with this thing. I think, I've lost about recognizing also what's missing and owning what's missing in the sense of publicly putting that up there. So if there's a blank wall that goes, this is missing from the archive, or like going like, or what next, or how do we ensure that or finding those real stories of real people to add to it, because everybody, working with Sandhya and the Windrush group, it's amazing to hear who's been around Devon for such a long time, and it's like those stories should get to be part of this archive in some way, because they've existed in the community, and I think that the issue I have with there's many issues I have with museums, but let's not go there, but is that it's such an academic analysis. Someone has come in, looked at some information, and has created a very one-dimensional perspective. And that's the thing. I think it's usually about perspectives and recognizing that, there's that amazing TED talk, isn't there, about the danger of a single story. And I think that's when I looked through those pictures and read some of the stuff, it's like, there's only a single story being told. But when you meet community members, it gives you that so many different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea of community stories. It just made me think, because Sandhya was talking about the Windrush project. I know that the Devon Development Education, one of the researchers associated with them, found stories of some mixed heritage young women who I think were formerly enslaved or the children of enslaved people, and they lived in Ottery St Mary, and that's a really interesting. There's so many stories that could be kind of told through theatre and in other art forms that we just don't know enough about them, really, do we? I think much more needs to be done. I think you're right that community stories really do add real people really do add richness to the whole thing. So just looking at time, okay. So the next question is one that I find quite tricky, but I'm sure you'll have thought about it anyway. So when I'm looking at some of the images, one of the things that are one of several things that were sort of problematic. That said, there's obviously some positive representation in the archive as well, looking at Thomas Baptiste's story and Helena Cullinan. So I think, there was some sort of positive representation, but also I think the thing that I struggled with was the white actors playing parts of East Asian characters or Asian characters or Black characters. And I just wanted to ask you really, where is that fine line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation? So many people get this, I don't want to say wrong, because there isn't necessarily a right or wrong, but so many people are very clumsy around this. And I just wondered what your thoughts were. How do we tell stories which can appreciate cultures that are different to our own? And how do we not culturally appropriate? How do we consider not exploiting stories, not exploiting artists, and moving away from stories as being commodities? We've talked a bit about that already. the stories being commodities. But yeah, where's the line? Where does this line, is there a line? Does it exist? And how do we not how do we walk along it and not fall off? Yeah, if you've got any thoughts on that, it'd be great to hear what you think. Sandhya?
It's like the game show, isn't it? Who gets to their cursor first? It's really complicated, isn't it? This conversation is really complicated because there isn't, for me, a clear answer, because again, history means that there's been so much cross-cultural fertilization and exchange that it's really, really difficult. And yet there are really, really clear and obvious examples. And I'm going to quickly give you two real life examples. Like there's a woman who set up a company to produce to promote young artists, sound makers, producers, and she's called her company Chakra Sounds. Now, chakra is an Indian Hindu Sanskrit word, right? Means sound. So in some ways it's kind of cool, you know, the whole thing is about sounds, healing, you know, dance, all of that stuff. But there was a young mixed heritage artist who was invited to join them, but he wanted to challenge that because that was actually his heritage. And he didn't mind the fact that the word chakra was being used, but what he wanted was an acknowledgement. Nowhere was there written anywhere on the literature about the history, the heritage, the roots of this word, some sort of acknowledgement. And actually it's a word that's used in a spiritual practice context, you know, taken out to become something that was kind of more entertaining. And so for me, that's a clear example of cultural appropriation. Same thing, there was a cafe in Exeter, this is live, you know, I got kind of invited in to try and do some mediation work between people, and it was all about dal and roti, you know, and it wasn't roti. It's really simple. It just was not roti, you know. And then when that was being questioned, the people didn't like being questioned. They didn't like being challenged. And there was complete, clear cultural appropriation going on there. So for me, it's about, again, coming back to, you know, when people are looking to represent another culture, it's kind of examining our own culture. You know, what is your own culture? What is the culture and the lens of the person who wants to do that cross-fertilizing? It's going and talking to those people, doing your active research and like wide active research, you know, generational questions and asking, and also, yeah, just kind of considering the context of how you're placing whatever it is, you know, in terms of performance and things. So those are my kind of quickie answers around that, but it is really complicated. It's
yeah,
really complicated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's really difficult, and you know, obviously we do have situations where lots of cultures have come together and they do merge together, and you know, that can add to the richness of a society, and that's absolutely fine. But I think your point about acknowledging the history of heritage is really key, actually. And I think I can think of lots of examples of cultural appropriation having lived in Devon. I mean, I went to school in Totnes, and there were an awful lot of white people in Totnes who went to India and came back with Indian names, having found themselves. There was an awful lot of white people with dreadlocks who liked reggae. And at the time, I thought it was great. You know, I was a teenager. I thought this was fantastic. I loved it. But looking back, there's an awful lot of cultural appropriation going on. And in relation to TV, not so much theatre, but one of the things I've noticed in TV recently, which really, really gets my goat, is what I call black accessories. So when they're not the main character, they're the people at a party, they're standing around looking cool, sipping drinks, and they just don't get a role. They're just one-dimensional, or even not even that, sometimes they don't even speak. So that's, I don't know so much about theatre, but in terms of TV and representation, that just sort of feels quite problematic. And it's thinking about really, so, you know, one of the things I'm always curious about is, can people who don't have lived experience of marginalisation tell the stories of marginalisation? I think that sometimes it's kind of okay if it's done sensitively and if it's acknowledged the history, like you say. But I think in an ideal world, we would make space for people with lived experience to tell those stories themselves. What do you think, Alix?
Yeah, do you know, I think it is really complicated, but I also think that we are in 2021 and we have got access to the world, you know, like never before. You Zoom has enabled us to be in different areas in Devon and have this conversation with each other, and to Zoom across the country, across the world, and speak to people. Like, we have so much information at our fingertips in an instant, and I feel like there's no excuse anymore to not do your research. There's no excuse anymore to ask the questions. There is so much out there, and so many people who are expertise and have knowledge that should be paid to be brought in to have those conversations, that there are artists everywhere, and it's like, it's no longer should it. Yeah, I just don't think there's any more excuses, to be honest. I think it's laziness. And I think, and laziness also equating to people not budgeting stuff in terms of, again, banging on about money. But I think it gets missed off in resources, and when people are designing budgets and thinking about things moving forward. So I think that there's that, and we haven't touched on it, but just thinking about what you were saying within television, there are not enough dark-skinned Black women given leading roles. Like, again, they tend to be the friend, and that's not good enough. And
that makes me so cross when they're just the friend going, "Oh, how are you?" and just completely supporting.
And we need to do better, and we need to have, there needs to be more conversations about colorism, and the privilege that I have as a mixed race person. Like, I am really conscious of that, and work really hard to I do the work. Everyone's got to be doing the work and doing the reading to educate themselves. And there are books, there are just so many things available that when you look at the archive, you go, okay, there wasn't those kind of conversations. Things were very much a taboo, but now it's like, come on. I've got no patience. For it.
You're absolutely right. There is no longer an excuse. You're absolutely right that people simply didn't have access to this information, up until recent years. I think you're absolutely right. And there isn't an excuse. We can educate ourselves really, really easily about
and things. And it's hard. Like, it is hard. I'm not saying it's easy by any means, but like,
it's doable. It's within reach, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, Sandhya, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I had my hand up. And also, I think the word that we haven't used is entitlement, because I think often what happens is that people just feel, and this is the legacy of colonialism, isn't it? An entitlement, that somehow we can just go over all around the world and take what we want, and do what we want with it, and that legacy has to stop. We just have to come back from that place of disrespect, and stealing and grabbing, because that's effectively what cultural appropriation is. So I think, asking the person who is from that background. We did a really great piece, by the way, with the Ram around that. Actually, we've made this great little film about Ganesh, the statue of Ganesh, and kind of asked those critical questions, and, what it means to be an object or an artifact versus something that's a living deity. It's quite interesting, Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds really good. The Ram are doing a few bits of work, aren't they? They're doing a big exhibition around links collections of slavery. I think it's Slave Trade next year, and they've had artists respond to a portrait of an African at the Ram as well. So they seem to be doing quite. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing. So I just wanted we only got 10 more minutes till we open up for Q&A, but there's a couple of questions I wanted to explore. So I don't know whether we should choose one to focus on. One of the questions was going to be, the tensions between theatre as entertainment versus theatre as educational activism. And then the other thing I wanted to ask really was, what else do we want to see going forward? So I guess we can finish with that one about going forward. So what are your thoughts on? I mean, we could even widen this out to the arts in general, So I think that, arts as entertainment or arts as activism, and I think, like, for me, I think I've always seen the arts as a social commentary, and I think it's a really good. Sociologically, it's like a little snapshot into what's happening at the time. So I think it really does need to have that sort of element to it, raising awareness about the social issues of the time, and sort of spreading that awareness and educating people. So for me, I think that's an important part of it. But one of the things that came up was, thinking about the play Slavery as an example, and the language was sort of talking around, I think I had it written down somewhere, I think it was around sort of comedy and participation for children, and that was a play that was taught to children. So yeah, how can we, what are your thoughts on, should theatre, can theatre be a space purely for entertainment, or do we need to consider education, activism at all times? Or yeah, what are your thoughts on those two?
For me personally, as a theatre maker, like I use theatre it is my tool for activism. And I had a debate with my friend once who runs a comedy focused theatre company, and she says, I just want to make theatre to entertain. And I said, why? She said, because there's so much miserable things going on in the world, and so I just want people to come to see the theatre and laugh. And I'm like, well, that's still political, like that's still an act of activism, because your choice is to make people laugh because of the world around. And she was like, and we ended up kind of back and forth. And I think that I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both. I think for me, my thing as a director is like, how do I keep people listening? And it's kind of using the entertainment to kind of come and know that you're being entertained, but looking at through the art, through what you're making, where can there be little seeds, little small moments of activism, or an invitation to be, an invitation to join the activism, or to kind of provoke questions and thinking. And, I think for young people, we underestimate what they watch now and what they're so much more active within activism. I say that looking like a 12-year-old, but I'm no longer, I'm in my 30s. But I think that young people are geared up and they are activists, and I think that I think sometimes people can patronize young people, and I think they want activism and they want that, but it can still be done in an entertaining way. I think the word education is interesting, because I think that's when the shutters can go down, when the moment people in the audience feel like you're preaching to me, or you're educating me. I didn't come here to be educated. And that's always a fine line. I'm always looking and going, am I trying to tell the audience how to think in this moment? And I think it's when it becomes that, I think for me, unless you're doing theatre and education, in which case you're in a school and you're there to provide, it's theatre becomes a tool to educate.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're right about I like your seeds of activism. That's really lovely, a lovely idea. I think in terms of young people, I think you're absolutely right. And I do think that this young generation, are quite do seem quite politically engaged and quite sort of switched on. And I guess for me, like entertainment I think the two work together. So I do kind of engage in quite a lot of dark content, I suppose, really, about quite bleak aspects of life, but I still feel entertained by it. So yeah, I guess you have both. Sandhya, did you have anything you wanted to sort of add to that discussion?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I wonder if I could do a comedy show about being a racist.
I'm sure you could. I mean, you could give it a go.
Let's together and do a show about being a racist.
Racists can be quite amusing, I think.
Well, yeah, totally. But in my life have been highly amusing, I can tell you. So
exactly. Yeah.
I think, yeah. For me, there isn't. The immediate answer that came was, oh, what's the point? What's the point unless it's going to teach you something, or make you feel, or think about something, or reflect, or ignite, or what would be the point? So I'm probably not the best person to go and see a panto, is what I'm coming to the conclusion.
Help me out too.
Even in pantos, there's morals, isn't it? Because that's the thing. What we're asking here is, what's the nature of storytelling? Why do we do it? And I think there is always it's always about some sort of learning zone and some sort of learning space. For me, yeah, absolutely. Theatre is such a great soft, subtle, and or direct, in your face potential to teach people and wake people up to something. And I think absolutely young people want that. And one of my focuses in work is about communities, doing this work with the Northcote. And, it's about, like, there's lots of different diverse communities, for example, in Exeter and Devon. They've got many, many stories to tell, not about their identity and difficulties, but actually about festivals that they might be celebrating and the story around that. Like, I celebrate Holi, and I'd love to somehow make that into a show where kids can be entertained, they can actually be educated, and everybody can learn about a festival from around the world that's actually taking place in their local space, in their local area, So that kind of representation, learning, education, and there's morals in there too, so that's what I'd add to it.
Thank you. Alix.
I think there's also joy in activism, and I think often activism gets given that kind of really negative lens that it's about, I think that it's kind of like pulling out that sense. Like the most frustrating thing for me is when I have conversations with organizations or talk about anti-racism and what they're doing, and it is I may as well, it's like being at a wake or something, like it's so like heavy, and I'm like, but I'm only interested in working with you if you have that joy, that you're like, yeah, I want to do this, but I want to make the organization a better place, like like it's having that passion, and that can exist in activism, and I think, and that's what theatre can give you, because you're sitting there and it's like boom, and you feel alive coming out of the theatre. But not panto, but I'm going to get some panto lovers are going to be on us now. Like, I'm sorry.
Sorry. They're not going to be happy. I did go to the panto at the Northcote last year, or the year before actually, and one of the things was because they had a black prince, and I was like, yay!
Okay.
It was like, no, of course I wanted to see that. There was a question. I don't know, should we just feed it in because it relates right now?
What was that then in the chat?
How do we best spark activism amongst audiences? So kind of following the thread. I mean, I don't know, don't let them leave the auditorium until they've signed your petition, given you 50 quid. I don't know, I think
that's not sparking, that's holding them hostage.
Yeah, I think it's about inspiring people.
Yeah. But, actually, good storytelling will ignite a will for change, and that's through empathy building, as well as education, teaching about injustice, and somehow solution focused. Somehow solution. And, things like, I think I really like what you said earlier, Alix, about the kind of, I think you were talking about it slightly differently in terms of the framing of a particular performance, but, Q&As after a show are a really good way, aren't they, to kind of help direct people. And it's really important in terms of human psychology to when, and optimism and hope, particularly when we're thinking about young people, to think about offering solution-focused thinking afterwards. Here's the issue. Now, what can we be doing together collectively to kind of solve that issue? Because the psychology and the human body needs to know that. Otherwise you're left in despair. You're left in. So we don't want that. We don't want our audiences going home in despair.
No, we don't. I think you're absolutely right about holding that space afterwards, and also even doing some prep as well around the questions. And I think one of you talked about sort of making sure the space is sort of okay to explore those issues. So I just, any final thoughts really on next steps for theatre and the Northcote before we sort of open up to more questions from the audience. So any sort of thoughts, what would we like to see going forward in terms of the archives or in terms of theatre in the Southwest generally? What are your sort of thoughts or hopes?
I think loads of more diverse programming everywhere. And I don't just mean in the theatre, I mean like with, music, arts, all the different arts kind of exhibition spaces, loads of diverse, more programming. And then also, I guess, really long term, I don't want to be having this conversation. It's really simple. I just want to go to a show where the director is a Black woman and half the cast is, from different ethnic backgrounds. And it's just no big deal. We're just not talking about it,
Yeah.
James Bond can be flipping Black. It's just not an issue. I want to go beyond that. That would be my wish and hope. Yeah.
Thank you, Sandhya.
Yeah.
Alix, what are your hopes for the future?
I think my hopes are that I work with a lot of young people and a lot of young artists, and I often have to check myself of going, why am I convincing them to stay in the Southwest? And And it feels like a lot of responsibility to provide constant opportunities and to provide that safe space for artists and young people. And I don't want to have to keep doing that. I want that to be shared. I want to be able to really comfortably and confidently say to an organisation, yes, you can work with this artist, or introduce that artist, knowing that they don't need, it's not that they need me to hold their hands, it's not about that, but knowing that I don't feel responsible for putting artists in those spaces that are not yet safe spaces. And I think that I'm make no apology for saying that, because I don't think that we are there yet. And I think that organizations have shifted, and I think that they are changing and they're wanting to do that. But there's a difference between, does everybody in your team want to? They're not just doing it because they've been told by senior management or like by the board that it's gone down. Like everybody's genuinely got to be on board. And I think that, programming has to be more than one show per season. It can't be tokenistic. And to keep the dialogue open so that it's a conversation as opposed to it always slipping into training. So Sandhya and I are not, and yourself, Louisa, like not constantly put in a position where we go, hang on a minute, this is not a meeting, this is a training session. It should be a conversation where we get something out of it as much as the organisation gets something out of it.
Absolutely, really well said, thank you. And I think thank you both. It's been fantastic talking to you, as I knew it would be, and we've covered a lot of ground, and there's lots more we could still cover. I think that going back to what you're saying, Alex, I don't think we're there yet by any means, but I think we are sort of taking small steps, and organisations across the South West are taking small steps, and hopefully we will move towards a future of greater inclusivity and representation. So thank you both. And shall I hand over to Sophie now to share some of the questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure. We've just had a couple in now. I'll bring this one up first. This is from Amy. It said, Alex, you mentioned very briefly earlier about tokenism. Would you be happy to talk about this more, and how you think casting can be more inclusive, representative, and thoughtful?
That's a small question. Yes. So I guess in terms of tokenism, I think that there's so many layers to it. As a theatre company and as an individual, people put us in their business plans or write about us and kind of communicate out to people that they're working with us without actually having a real genuine conversation, and just kind of use us in that tokenistic nature to say like, oh, well, we're working with Alex or working with Beyond Face. And I think in terms of like an organizational point of view, I think often I get emails a lot going, about casting, and kind of people, you can read through an email sometimes when you're going, oh, you're just wanting to cast someone because you need to do it, as opposed to being really interested in who the actor might be and talking about their skills. Often people will email about the skin color rather than the skills that an actor has, and then going, oh yeah, we're looking for this really highly skilled physical performer, but we're really wanting to cast from from an ethnically diverse background. In terms of casting, I think, it's, as I said earlier, like there's loads of people out there, like Twitter, like there's just so many platforms available. It's more about, for me, it's going, looking at the city that you're casting into, and what is the story of the city or the town or wherever it's going, and what's the story of your building, your organization, like going, do people really want to come into that space? Like if they look on, again, it's like going back to the website and various things and looking at it and going, am I going to have a good time there? Am I going to look at the meet the team page or whatever of who works at the organization? Am I going to see those faces? Am I going to see myself represented in those spaces? It's like all of those. And if not, what is the organization doing about it? If you've got an all-white organization, where can I read and find out, and how am I going to be supported? Because I think it's easy to get, you know, it does become very tokenistic, and then the experience when you step in there isn't always a positive one. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
I was just going to add to something about, I think you said earlier, Alex, about not everybody in the organisation is necessarily on board with anti-racism or inclusion. I think that is an important part of it, really, sort of getting greater buy-in across the organisations, and so that people understand the benefits of anti-racist work and inclusion. Because I think that if people see it as just an add-on, just an extra thing they've got to do, and don't really want it, then it's not going to happen. It's, you know. And I think part of that is about the conversations as well, not just the training and the sort of formal aspect, but actually the conversations and opening those up a bit more, so that people sort of genuinely, you know, feel committed to this and see the benefits, because not everybody sees the benefits of inclusion straight away. Sandhya, is there anything you wanted to add to that? No?
And so I would say, like, often Eclipse Theatre did a really interesting report on risk. And I'm happy to send it around to you, but it's a really interesting report that often theatres think that programming, you know, black theatre makers work, or black theatre companies, is a risk. And so that's a big problem, which is that you don't get the buy-in, because you go, we don't, and I hear it all the time in Exeter and Plymouth, like, it's the problem is that it's really white here. Like, I kid you not, like, most of our audiences that Beyond Face have are 70% people who aren't white, and that's without us doing any audience development, because we've got no money to be able to do that. So that people are absolutely out there, and we're not a risk. Thank you very much. You make very good theatre. Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Alex. That's really good to hear about your audiences as well, and a bit interested to find out more about that report. Sandhya, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think just following on from that, really, that, you know, there is a kind of constant in the kind of organizational consultancy work that I do, there's a constant referring back to, there's low numbers in, you know, of people, and therefore that need doesn't need to be met. It's like an excuse, but actually what we know is that because of the low numbers, when we're talking about racism, marginalization, you know, impact, it's even greater, right? Stats tell us that. So, and then kind of pulling in what we were talking about earlier, like, you know, where's the theatre's power and responsibility in programming, and then convincing those panto audiences that they really need to come and watch this show. Because that's what I learned from my audience development, you know, work, is that how do we convince that, you know, there is, you know, these theatre spaces, these art spaces, art centres, you know, have full houses for other shows. So why is it that these, you know, what is the cultural mindset that needs to change in the bigger picture? And it starts with self, doesn't it? As always, it will start with the institution, with the organisation. As Alex said, you know, is everybody on board? If they're not on board, why not? You know, what do they need to learn? What do they need to wake up to? What do they need to read? Where do they need to be challenged by their own staff team? You know, how does the building need to look? I know there's a question about decolonizing. You know, what does it need to look like? How does it feel for that building to be a welcoming building? Where's the acknowledgement of the architecture? You know, the references, all of that stuff comes into, changing, shifting mindsets and cultures. Yeah.
Shall we look at the question which says, as creators of colour who have both grown up in the Southwest? Sophie, are you happy? Sorry, I'm taking over. I just thought that was a really interesting question.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting for reasons, but yeah.
So as creators of colour who've both grown up in the Southwest, what has encouraged you to stay and work here? So I'm happy to answer first. And first of all, it's my home, and I did think quite a lot about various different times about moving to London. But the reality was I was a single mum living in a council estate on benefits at first when my children were young, before I went back to education. And the only option of moving to London would have been to do a house swap. And I didn't feel like I wasn't prepared to live on an inner city estate in London, because I didn't have that background, I didn't have that experience, and I felt quite scared of doing that. My children have family down here, and I just wanted to stay and bring them up in a place that I see as beautiful, and the landscape and the beaches and the light and the freedom and the fresh air. And I wanted to stay, partly for my children, but partly because I didn't know where else to go. Like, you know, this is my home. So I think that was why I stayed. And And I think it makes me really sad when people say, oh, you know, what are you doing living in the Southwest? Or if young people of colour say, well, I'm not going to stay here. Or if I hear a friend saying, I'm not going to move my kids down there because they're, you know, ethnically diverse background, and I don't think it would be safe for them. That makes me really sad. And I do sort of wish that more people felt it was okay to stay. But having said that, that in itself is not going to necessarily change the infrastructure. It's not going to change the culture of racism that we have down here. Just having more numbers isn't going to make a difference. We really do need to make bigger changes in the cultures and the institutional racism and other forms of discrimination that we have. That's so, you know, across all sectors and all our institutions. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. And obviously that sort of ties in with decolonisation as well, which is the earlier question. But that was my experience. And in terms of being a creative, I didn't plan to be. It happened, and it happened because I started writing poetry because I wanted to express my story of being mixed race in Devon, and I didn't know anybody else who wasn't white, you know. So that was my driving force, was to tell those stories, really, in the hope that I would inspire other people to tell their stories, and also for the wider white community to learn really what it was like for people like me. Alix, what sort of encouraged you to stay and work in the Southwest?
I guess a couple of things. I mean, I went to university in Plymouth, but it got introduced to the Barbican Theatre and had an amazing time there, and they opened up my eyes to what theatre could do and what theatre could be, and allowed me to kind of connect globally. So I think massively that, but I think I just always listening, being in those spaces and hearing people in cultural spaces talking about, oh, this is what the city needs, this is what the Southwest needs, and just feeling like it's never going to grow if people always leave. And I think kind of in a way, like, I don't know how to be anywhere but here. And that's not to say that, you know, there's other cities that I'd really love to spend time living in. There's other places in the world that I'd really like to go. But it is, it's weird. Someone said it to me, like, I've always feel out of my comfort zone in spaces, but also this is my comfort. My comfort zone is to be out of my comfort zone in a weird kind of contradictory way. And also, I guess the other reason is that all the work that I do with Beyond Face, and I try to do as an artist, is always through consultation, through speaking with people. And every time I've got an idea for a new project, I will share it with people. And what I hear back is that there's a need. And when before I set Beyond Face up, I had an idea for it. And I remember when I finished university, I wrote a one-page proposal of like running a black theatre company in Plymouth, and showed it to someone. They were like, that would never happen down here. And I remember these two extraordinary young black women in Plymouth who were just about to go off to university, and they said to me on separate occasions, they said, Alix, please, will you do something for us? Like, that Plymouth really needs something. Like, please, will you set something up? So they are the reason. And the young people that we work with and the artists that we work with are my reasons to stay, because there's still a need. And that's the activist in me, I think.
Thank you, Alix. Sandhya, was there anything you wanted to add about living and working in the Southwest?
It's funny, isn't it? Because I was slightly struck by that question, really, around just the very notion that because you're women of colour and you're creative in the Southwest, that there's a possibility, because there's an assumption, isn't there, in that question, you know, and it's a really well-meaning question. I get that, of curiosity, but there's also a slight assumption in the question that there are so many things that may not make it work for you to stay here, which we kind of know. Like, you know, I know from education, that's what happens with teachers. They come and train down here and then they don't stay. They leave, you know, people leave their jobs. So, you know what, I mean, I'm a creative, you know, I'm a storyteller, by the way, whoever asked that question. You know, what makes me stay is, it's really beautiful here, right? It's a beautiful place. Devon is an amazingly beautiful place to live in. And, you know, I get completely resourced from being out in the landscape. You know, I get inspired, resourced, and I'm a tree hugger. So, you know, that makes me stay here. You know, I don't really hug trees, but yeah.
Oh, don't you? I have been known to. what's wrong with hugging trees? Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think, the bit about staying did make me sort of think, oh, okay, but it's just like, it's my home, and it's for I wanted to bring my kids up.
And I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because what Alix said, and when if you're an activist, you become a part of the space that you live in, the community and the people. So, and if you're an activist, you hold responsibility. So if you see a need, you address that need. That's how and that keeps me here too. And there's a kind of really beautiful uniqueness of shaping my identity, if you like, of a woman of colour, an Indian Gujarati woman of colour living in Devon, just about to convert my van and live a van life, for a bit. It's that kind of...
that's exciting.
I wondered how long it'd be till the van.
I didn't know about the van. I'm very excited to hear about this.
That, isn't it? It's that kind of like, whoa, there's all these amazing, exciting... I'm not going to give up my house, by the way, because I can't. I'm too old and I like my comforts. But, it's that like, wow, it offers all these amazing possibilities that I wouldn't get if I was in Bristol or London. So it's actually like, it's flipping the stories, coming back to that thing about celebrations, versus trauma. There's incredible reasons to stay, right? There's incredible reasons.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I also get a lot out of nature as well, connecting with landscape. Not as much as I'd like to, so I always seem to be very busy, but certainly I do try and make time to do it. It nourishes me. Sophie, were there any other questions you wanted to sort of very quickly try and answer, or was there any final thoughts or comments you wanted to add?
No, I feel like the other questions that have come up have been really fully answered actually by the kind of conversation. And I feel, and also time wise, I don't know if you want to maybe have some closing comments from each panelist, and and that'd be a nice way to finish.
Okay, I can't think what to say. I just want to say, it's been a fantastic conversation with Sandhya and Alix, and I love chatting to you both. I want to do more of this, basically. Hopefully that there are more opportunities to do that. And I want to find out more about the Resilient Roots session, which I haven't managed to come to yet. But it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with everyone and being so honest. And thank you. Do you have anything, Sandhya or Alix?
Alix, I'm going to let you go first.
What to say? I guess I just wanted to echo something that we mentioned earlier, in that I can only speak for myself, but everything I've said this evening has come from my lived experience. And you might come across another Black mixed race person who has a very different opinion to mine, and I think that that's okay. But I only speak here from me as Alix Harris in this space, and that I don't have all the answers, and I'm still learning new things every day and still asking myself questions, and I feel really hopeful. Do I feel really hopeful? I feel slightly hopeful for the future, but I am very apprehensive about kind of the world opening back up again, and that in terms of archive, that we don't actually walk out and go back into the archive. Thank you.
Sandhya.
Yeah, no, I really like that. It's a really lovely way to put it. Yeah, like we don't walk back into the past. I think I just want to say I've really enjoyed this conversation. And I think what's really struck me is that the three of us have never worked together before, been on the same space before, and yet there's a kind of effortless here. And I think that kind of really sings to shared experiences, that are unspoken. And I think that's kind of really a lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about storytelling in for example, the theatre space, and how that's represented. So I really enjoyed that. There's so much work to do. So this conversation is fantastic. It's like a little starter, isn't it? It's a little taster, but there's a lot of work to do. And at the moment, there's a lot of eagerness to do that work. And I want people to pause and reflect and get really clear about what it is that they really want to do the work on, and what is the work that is needed, and have we got the right people in place? Are we asking the right questions, et cetera, et cetera? Yeah.
Listen to respond, not listen to react.
Yeah, response able, yeah. And just to say, Alix thinks that she's the reason why I'm staying in the Southwest, and I want to say that she's the reason why I might leave.
You are so rude. Now, we've got witnesses now to your rudeness. So it's the recording of this. So
thank you for asking us on this talk. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you for being here. So hand over to you, Sophie, for any final.
Just like huge thank you. It's been a really amazing discussion and lots of moments of the joy of activism I felt in the conversation as well, which has been really, really wonderful. And just to say, if anybody is interested in learning a bit more about Louisa's work and with the archive and learning a bit more about those focus groups that we're going to be running, then just get in touch. It's heritage@exeternorthcott.co.uk for a bit more information. And we're going to we really want to continue this conversation. And I've been scribbling away notes, even though I know that this is being recorded, for the lead and the steer for where the work goes next. So really, really thank you for your generous contributions, and for the audience as well for your questions, and for being a part of it as well. Thank you very much. And I think we'll close it there.